It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ray Goldstein. He's the Schlumberger Professor of Complex Physical Systems in the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics at Discrete. And even though his research deals with interdisciplinary research, deals with biological physics, he'll be here talking about the lessons from old literature today. So please, let's give a round of applause.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I don't think I've spoken in front of this society, and it's nice to see such a diverse audience of ages and I think backgrounds from what I've gathered. On occasions like this, it's generally the case that someone would speak on their research passions and tell everyone. I thought it might be interesting to change things up a little bit and tell you about an issue that I've been fixated on for a while on the side, having to do with the following, which is that a paradox of our digital age is that it's easier than ever before to read papers from long ago. But the tendency for all of us is to focus only on the latest papers that have just come out last week and sort of to forget about what has gone in the past. And my purpose today is to be, by way of example, sort of mentorial to the younger people and just giving a reminder to the older people about the benefits that can come from reading the old literature. And the genesis of this talk, in some ways, is an article that I wrote for the physics publication, Physics Today, which is published by the American Physical Society about a year ago, which grew out of years of my experience, which is really no different than probably most of yours, which is that I would come across something in the literature and it would appear to be new, or it was claimed to be new, and I would realize that actually it had been done 60 years ago, or 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And didn't those stupid authors know that this had gone before them? Now, I was equally guilty of such offenses, but I thought it would actually be good to try to put this all together into kind of a pep talk about what can be learned from the old literature. So as I've said on the few occasions I've given this talk in the past, I will embarrass nobody in this room. But that doesn't mean I won't embarrass people who are outside this room. But it is being recorded, so now I'm in trouble. So I want to just start with this wonderful comment from Frank Westheimer. Now, the last time I put this up when I gave this talk in Trinity College, somebody thought that I was Frank Westheimer and I was an American chemist. So it's true I have a degree in chemistry, but I'm not Frank Westheimer. A month in the laboratory can often save you an hour in the library. You get the joke, I hope. And so let's start with a question about a piece of science which is probably known to most of you, no matter what your background, at least you've heard of it, which is Brownian motion. And so my question is, who was Robert Brown? How many of you, without looking up there, know who Robert Brown was? What kind of scientist was Robert Brown? Not you. A few plants in the audience. He was a botanist. Right? He wasn't a physicist, he wasn't a mathematician. He was a botanist, a very distinguished botanist, who wrote this amazing paper in 1828 about things that he found read the title, Brief Account of Microscopical Observations Made in the Months of June, July, and August, blah, blah, blah. It's a very long and descriptive title, but basically he looked primarily at things in plants, but he also looked at ground up particles of charcoal and minerals and all these things, and what he found, which we now call Brownian motion, is that on the supermicroscopic scale, micron-sized particles or so, viewed under the microscope, are in incessant motion. And it's not because they're living, we check that by studying many different kinds of things, it's because they are small and subject to the endless collisions of water molecules around them, and the slight imbalances of those collisions give rise to random motion. Now I bring this up because it's a good starting point to understand an important aspect of what I'm going to say today, which is that many of us have heard of these problems and we've never bothered to read the original papers. And going back to these original papers, which you can get a digital version online, it's trivial. Just go to philmag.com, not quite, but you go to the Philosophical Magazine website and you can just read any of these, and they're really instructive. So this talk is structured in a way that's a little different from your usual talk. I haven't given you an outline of what I'm going to say. You should think of this like a movie with what's called a cold open. So right now, I'm just taking you into a story, and then we'll back up and start to go. Now, many people have heard of this paper, but what they don't know is that there was a follow-up paper a year later, in which he responded to certain critics of his first paper as to whether there were artifacts of one sort or another. But he also made the following comment in that first paper. He says, the facts ascertained respecting the motion of the particles of the columns were never considered by me as wholly original. So he goes on to say that other people had seen the kinds of phenomena that he described, but in his opinion, they hadn't really understood it. So even he is acknowledging that there was something going on before. And this brings me to a very important point, which is something known as Stigler's law of, oops, let's try it now. Is it going to work? Or not? Yes. Stigler's law of eponymy. That no scientific discovery is named after its original discovery, right? Because after all, why do we call it Brownian motion? Because if he wasn't the original, it should be called something else. But the thing is, you know that Stigler's law is true. It actually, Stigler's law was discovered by Merton. So it's usually named after the second person. Which actually brings me to an important point. There is something known as Hinchliff's rule, which is that if the title of a scholarly article is a yes or no question, the answer is no. You've probably seen this. Now, I'm proud of the fact that I wrote a paper recently that actually yes or no question, the answer to which was yes. But generally, it's true that the answer is no. Except, then you're confronted with this paper. No answer, the answer is no. This paper demonstrates that it's false, but only if it's true. Sorry, I got lost there. Anyway, let's get back to Brown. So here's Brown's second paper, which is, actually, it's 1 year later in the Phil Mag series with the same page numbers. It's very confusing. Additional remarks on active molecules. So Brown was already using the term active molecules, which is very close to the term active matter, which is all the rage now in condensed matter physics and biophysics and fluid mechanics. And one of the things that he was forced to talk about, which was raised as a possible artifact in his observations, which remember, were under a microscope. He was looking at tiny drops of water under a microscope, on a microscope stage, and what do small drops do? They evaporate. And so he was very conscious of the fact that evaporation could produce some sort of flow within those drops, which might disguise what he was really dealing with. So he said, it may here be remarked that those currents, he means fluid currents, from the center to the circumference, that means from the center of each drop to its edge, at first hardly perceptible, then more obvious and at last very rapid, which constantly exist in the drops exposed to air, and disturb or entirely overcome the proper motion of the particles. That means this random motion that he's been talking about. In other words, the fluid flows overwhelm the random motion, are wholly prevented in drops of small size immersed in oil. If you cover it with oil, it doesn't evaporate, so hence it must be from evaporation, a fact which is only apparent in those drops that are flattened in consequence of being in contact with the surface of the microscope. Now, when I first read this, which was about 10 years ago, I almost fell off my chair. Not because this isn't sort of an obvious statement, in modern view, but because it reminded me of something that I knew in the literature that many of you may be familiar with, at least in general experience, if not in scientific literature. And that is what is known as, the coffee drop problem. So, take a cup of freshly made coffee, stick your finger in or a spoon, put a drop on a nice white countertop, and let it dry. Now, if I didn't tell you what happened, or you had never experienced it, you might imagine that, well, it's just sort of a uniformly brown circle. Because the stuff evaporates, the little particles of suspended coffee settle to the bottom, and it's uniformly brown. But it isn't. You can do this experiment in the lab. So with my PhD student, George Fortune, we just drop some coffee on a light table and let it dry, and this is what you get. So the coffee particles accumulate at the edge. And so if this were a circular drop, you'd call it a ring. So this is the coffee ring effect, or the coffee drop effect. Now, this is an everyday experience, but actually it was the subject of a very interesting scientific paper about 20 years ago. Now, this paper, Capillary Flow as the Cause of Ring Stains from Dried Liquid Drops, is authored by a bunch of my friends, including Ray Cooper, who was shortly after that a postdoc with me. So I have nothing but admiration for all of these. And this paper has been extremely highly cited. This was a year and a half ago, 3,000 citations. It's probably 4,000 citations by now, but that's a lot. Right? And so what these scientists did was to try to understand the physics of this. And they said, here we ascribe the pattern in the deposition to a form of capillary flow in which pinning of the contact line of the drying drop ensures that liquid evaporating from the edge is replenished by liquid from the interior. In other words, there's a flow from the center to the edge, which carries the particles. this paper. And I read Brown and I said, well, wait a minute. Brown discovered that in 1828. What are they talking about? And the answer was, okay, they actually, they said, to flow out, they could carry all the particles dispersed to the edge. So, of course, what they went on to do was to show the mathematics and the physics of exactly why this was true, which Brown didn't know. But it was kind of ridiculous that such a famous paper as Brown's was unknown to them, and they had basically rediscovered this phenomenon. And I thought that was kind of ridiculous. So I emailed my friends and I said, did you know that Brown discovered this in 1828? And not a single one of them knew it. Of course, neither did I. Before, I just happened to stumble on Brown's paper. So I'm not trying to assign blame here. I'm just saying this is kind of a silly state of affairs. Let's talk a little bit about the physics of this. This is kind of interesting. Now, I know it's a diverse audience here, some of whom are medics and natural scientists and maybe a few mathematicians and chemists and anybody else I've missed. But let me try to take you through this. So imagine you have a drop of radius r. So this is on the order of a centimeter or so. And what we're going to imagine is that the water vapor that comes off it, of course, is diffusively moving around in the atmosphere. There might be wind, but let's forget that. And we want to basically understand the timescale it takes for a little parcel of evaporated water vapor to kind of equilibrate across the drop above it. And we're just going to use dimensional analysis. So basically, if d is the diffusion constant of water vapor in air, then the timescale to diffuse across the drop is r squared over d. And we know what d is for typical substance like water. And so you find that this is about a 20th of a second, which basically means that on the timescale of an hour or two for the droplet to dry, the water is constantly in equilibrium above it. So you don't actually have to solve a time-dependent problem. Water vapor, you just have to solve a steady-state problem of the diffusion equation above a drop. Now, the drop is so flat, you might as well just think of it as a disk, in which this is basically solving what's called Laplace's equation above a disk, and it's basically like a problem in electrostatics. And you can look it up, except that on the countertop, there's no flux of fluid through, there's no flux of vapor, but on the drop, there is a source. So it's a standard problem. You can look up the solution anywhere, a bunch of Bessel functions, and you can write the concentration as the arc sign of this function of the little radius r, wherever I am from the center outward. Here's the radius of the drop, and here's the coordinate z. So if I take the derivative at z equals 0, multiplied by the diffusion constant, I get the fixed law flux of stuff coming up. And you do all that, and you discover that it looks like this. 1 over the square root of the radius squared minus my coordinate, r squared. So as I go to the edge, there's this square root singularity, this huge enhancement of the evaporation at the edge, and that's what pulls the fluid out from the center. And so those physicists did this calculation, Brown did this, and then they coupled that to the fluid flow in, and they were able to explain everything. So it would have, of course, taken nothing away from their beautiful results to have quoted Brown, but they just happened not to know it. Now, you might ask, why was I reading Phil Lang from 1829? I mean, I don't just go regularly into the library and say, oh, I tell you, I'll read this. And the answer was actually part 3. So in Dammit, I co-taught a course with Ulrich Kaiser and Cavendish for a number of years on basically soft matter and biological physics. And Brownian motion, especially in the context of what Einstein did in 1905 in one of his great papers, is an important subject. And I thought, instead of just reading modern descriptions, we should all read the original paper and try to understand it. And so I thought I should start by reading them myself. And so I made this long list of papers, and one of them was Brown's paper, and then I happened to discover it. So actually, teaching can have its benefits in that way too. A friend of mine at Yale said this once: there's no statute of limitations in the literature. So just because it's a certain age doesn't mean you get away with not referencing it. Okay, so that's the cold open. This is now the basis of what I want to talk about, an article that appeared last year in Physics Today. And I'll be talking about a number of different subjects that, by way of example, give us some insight into the benefits of reading the old literature. So I'll call the first part a teachable moment, a moment where we can take an important lesson about things that we should know. I'm going to then argue that you can see interesting connections between fields if you take the trouble to try to read the old literature. And I'm going to use an example from biophysics and plant science to show that. Then I'm going to actually lay some blame, actually at the feet of a Nobel Prize winner, about what we might say is doing due diligence. That is, you better check if you're going to claim that something's novel, that it really is. And we'll see a nice example of that is not happening in the context of something known as time crystals. And then the last major part will be what I call discovering inspirational cleverness. That sometimes, especially when you're dealing with experimental studies from long ago, where equipment was very rudimentary, the cleverness with which people devised experiments to yield interesting and profound results can be inspirational, and give you ideas of things that you could do now that might be equally important. So I'll give two examples. One is studying what's called the action spectrum of photosynthesis, and the other about how flagella. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about Alan Turing's analysis. So let's start with cell receptors. So a very classic paper written by Howard Berg and Ed Purcell being one of the developers of nuclear magnetic resonance. In 1977, it was called Physics of Chemoreception. And this is a beautiful article, very highly cited, probably 1,000 times, for its explanation of all sorts of different physical concepts applied basically to how cells measure their environment. And the classic example of that is that on the surface of a cell, let's say the cell membrane, there may be embedded proteins which act as receptors. Basically, they bind ligands that are out in solution by some reversible process. And by reading out the occupancy of the receptors, the cell makes a decision about its behavior. It may change its flagellar action to go in the direction of more of that or away. It may do all sorts of things. So this is a standard issue, which is basically, suppose I have a certain number of receptors on the surface of the membrane, and I have a certain concentration of ligands out in solution. What is the rate at which the ligands will come to those receptors? And if you just imagine the simplest case, it would be by diffusion. So Berg and Purcell did the following calculation. They said, let's imagine we have a spherical cell of radius capital R, and it's covered with a certain number of receptors. We'll just imagine that there are capital N of them, and each of them is a little circular disk embedded in the membrane. So we have the little radius little a of the disk, and we have the big radius R of the cell. And of course, if the receptors cover the entire surface, then basically the question that we're trying to get at here is what is the rate at which, by diffusion, material comes to a spherical absorber? And this is a problem that was solved multiple times in the past. It's usually associated with the name of Smoluchowski. And the flux of ligands in goes like 4 pi times the radius of the cell, the diffusion constant of the ligands, and the concentration at infinity, C0. Notice it doesn't go like R squared, it goes like R. How many of you have encountered that fact before? I need to get some calibration. None. Is that correct? Okay. So you might think R squared because, after all, that's the surface area of the sphere, right? 4 pi R squared. It goes like R because the flux is proportional to the gradient of material coming in. And while it's true that the surface scales like R squared, the steady state concentration profile falls off with distance such that the gradient looks like 1 over the radius on the surface. So there's a factor of 1 over R that is canceling it. Okay, so you're left with just this linear. But this is sort of well known. The question is basically what fraction of the surface should I cover with these receptors to get an uptake rate that's anywhere near this? You know, is it just proportional to the surface area? If I cover 1% of the surface with receptors, do I get 1% of the uptake? That was the question that Berg and Purcell were asking. And again, they made a little mathematical mapping. They said, well, the steady state diffusion problem, which is just like the one I was saying for the coffee drop, is Laplacian with the concentration of 0. That looks like a problem in electrostatics, if I want to find the electrostatic potential around a bunch of conductors. And so they said, the general result is that if I could talk about the electrical capacitance of my object, that flux I'm interested in is actually can be rewritten in terms of the capacitance of that object. Now, if I think of each of the circular receptors as a little conducting disk, then I can talk about the uptake to each of them, and that will go like its radius times d times the concentration of infinity. And now the question is, how do you add this all up over many receptors? Now that's a slightly complicated problem. I'm just going to quote you the answer. The answer looks something like this, that the flux of material divided by the maximum flux is this ratio. Number of receptors times their radius divided by R plus the number of receptors in it. So again, you have with these factors of the radius, not the radius squared. And so if you have a low concentration of receptors, so the area fraction would be the total area of receptors divided by the sphere area. If you write everything in terms of that, you discover this ratio for low n looks like 4 over pi, which is 1, times the volume fraction, or the area fraction, but with a prefactor that's the radius of the sphere divided by the radius of the receptor. Now, a cell could be microns in size, and a receptor could be nanometers in size. So there's a factor of 1,000 there. And so this is the factor you would have naively expected just by area arguments, and there's a prefactor of 1,000. That's not obvious that they found it. Okay, so you can see that actually if you cover the surface with 10 to the minus 3 area fraction, you'll get about half the uptake you get if you cover the whole surface, which is incredibly non-intuitive. You agree? Please say yes. Good. Okay. So that's kind of neat. And everyone in biophysics, like myself, knows this. You know, we've all been brought up on this paper. You go to any biophysics department, physics department, math department, where there are biophysicists, you say, tell me about Berg and Purcell, and the first thing they'll all say is, oh yeah, the receptor calculation, like I just said. Everyone knows this. Okay. Now, just to kind of put this in perspective, keep that in mind, I'm going to make a slight digression to tell you about a research problem I was interested in about 6 or 8 years ago that seems like it's totally unrelated. And this has to do with leaf stomata. Any plant sciences? Plant scientists in the audience? Okay, so stomata are the pores on leaves, usually the underside, that open and close to allow the plant to breathe, essentially, to do the respiration that it needs to. That is, it can allow carbon dioxide and oxygen to flow in and out, and water vapor, of course, will leave or enter, but usually leave because the plant is more humid than the environment. So here's a picture, and this is a particularly interesting picture provided by Brian Ford. This is a picture of the epidermis, the surface of an orchid leaf, imaged with Robert Brown's original microscope of 1828. Okay. And yeah, obviously there's a digital camera attached to it, but the point is that what you see here are the individual stomata. The scale bar is 50 microns. Remember, a hair, if you have any, is about 100 microns across. So this is half the width of a hair. And there are these individual stomata, and the rest of these are just the rest of the surface of the leaf. And these stomata have this kind of shape like that, and they open and close and allow stuff to come in and out. And when I first started learning about this problem, I was interested in a phenomenon involving the spatial variations of photosynthetic activity across a leaf. And I thought, well, I should look at a leaf. So I looked at a leaf under the microscope, and just like this, I noticed that the area fraction occupied by the stomata was rather low. And then I said, Berg and Purcell, right? So maybe the reason that nature chose the area fraction to be as low as it is because in terms of the rate at which things would either enter or leave the leaf, you don't need any more area fraction because of the same physics that Berg and Purcell were talking about, namely diffusion. After all, most things near the surface would be governed by diffusion. So then I thought, wow, this is neat. I'm going to write a really important paper in plant science where I tell all the plant scientists, guess what? There's this beautiful calculation by these biophysicists that explains why leaves have such a low area coverage of stomata. Then I thought, well, I better read a little bit more before I make such a claim. And so I started going back to the literature to see where people did these calculations, and I discovered, yeah, there was a hint of it here and there. And then I discovered this. Some Problems of Evaporation by Harold Jeffreys, fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge, 1918, where he asked himself the following question. What is the rate of evaporation of water from the surface of the leaf relative to what would happen if the entire leaf were wet? Which is, of course, exactly Berg and Purcell's question, except in reverse. And what did he do? Well, he made an analogy to a problem in electrostatics, where he basically said, well, if I had a certain conductivity and I had a certain voltage, I could basically relate my calculation to the capacitance of this system. I could get the rate of transference in terms of the capacitance of this thing viewed as a capacitor, and I could view each little pore on the leaf like its own little disk of capacitance, and I knew that calculation, and when all is said and done, he did exactly the same calculation that Berg and Purcell did, and he gets the following result, that the evaporative flux divided by the maximum possible is the area fraction occupied by the ratio of the size of the leaf to the size of the stomata, which could easily be 1,000. So it was all there in 1918. And then I thought, my goodness, this is ridiculous. But I know Howard Berg. He spent a year in my lab as a visitor. He's about 85 now. And if there's anyone who knows the old literature, it's Howard Berg. Trust me, he knows everything that's been written on bacteria and chemotaxis and all these things. But he's not a plant scientist, and he didn't know about this paper. And I can't hold it against him. I can only say there's something to be learned by getting out of your little intellectual silo of thinking, well, this problem's defined in this field and it's never been seen somewhere else. And if you just look around and think, well, diffusion, maybe someone did something somewhere else, you can learn something. So this I thought was quite amazing and really interesting. It was the exact same mapping. There we go. Okay. So next thing I want to say is about doing due diligence. And as I said, without reading it, the old literature is important as it means to be accurate in claims of knowledge, particularly when moving into a new area. And in my Physics Today paper, I said, some might say that in truly cutting-edge fields, there's no long history to master, almost by definition. That's a very tricky argument. And let me give you an example. So back in 2012, Frank Wilczek, who shared the 2004 Nobel Prize with David Gross and David Holitzer for the discovery of what's called asymptotic freedom in high-energy physics, wrote this extremely interesting paper called Quantum Time Crystals. So we're all used to the idea of physical crystals, sodium chloride, a metal, whatever, in which we have a lattice of particles. And the way that it's often thought of in condensed matter physics is to say that the original Hamiltonian, the energy function that governs all of these atoms and molecules, does not distinguish one point in space from another. There's nothing in it that tells you that this point is different from that point. It's just a bunch of pairwise interactions between particles. There's no reference system, there's no reference frame. It's just a bunch of pairwise interactions. And so what you can say is that this energy function, this Hamiltonian, has a continuous translational symmetry. If I take the world and I just move it by an arbitrary amount to the right, nothing changes. The energy doesn't change because all the distances have been moved. And I can move an arbitrary amount. There's no special value I have to move. It's a continuous symmetry. But when a crystal forms, obviously something has changed. Now, this particle is here, this particle is here. And I've replaced the continuous symmetry with a discrete symmetry in the sense that if I just moved, assuming all the particles are the same, if I just move one lattice site, everything looks the same to me. So I've replaced a continuous symmetry with a discrete symmetry. And Wilczek said, we all know and love this, but what about, instead of space, time? In other words, could I have a system in which the underlying energy structure doesn't care about this particular time or that particular time, but the system transforms into a state in which there is some sort of clock. There's some sort of broken continuous symmetry, and now at the most I might imagine a discrete symmetry. So it develops basically a period of oscillation. Okay, that was his question. And on the face of it, you think, wow, what a profound idea. It's really neat. So the possibility, what he calls time crystals, analogous to ordinary crystals, they represent spontaneous emergence of a clock within a time-invariant dynamical system. Now he was interested in a quantum time crystal, so he means a system obeying the laws of quantum mechanics, which in its lowest energy state would spontaneously do this. And he gave an example in which he imagined a particular setup which is well known in condensed matter physics. It's basically a ring of particles that move around, threaded by a magnetic field. And at a certain limit, he found what he asserted was the lowest energy state of the system, which is basically a lump of particles that travels around at some frequency. And because it's a lump, and it goes at a frequency, there's an identifiable clock in the system. If everybody were uniformly spaced and moving around, you wouldn't see anything. But it's this lump that moves around that represented that. So he said, you see, here's an example. Unfortunately, it was wrong. Patrick Bruno in Grenoble saw this paper when it first appeared on the arXiv, the preprint arXiv, so some months before publication. He said, this doesn't make any sense. It can't be. And he went back and looked at the calculation, and he realized that he could find a lower energy state of the system, which didn't have that property, which had no clock to it. And therefore, the Wilczek simply made a mistake. And so Patrick wrote a comment basically saying, you're wrong, and then he proved a little theorem that says, this can't happen. And the reason basically is that it would be a perpetual motion machine. And in fact, there's a policy adopted by the American Physical Society that deplores attempt to mislead and defraud the public based on claims of perpetual motion machines. So, and then after this, there were several proofs that various conjectured experimental ways of realizing this that came out after Wilczek's paper were themselves impossible. There were proofs, rigorous mathematical proofs that this wouldn't work either. So basically, it's not going to happen in equilibrium. But people are clever. And various people, including Chetan Nayak, who was long ago a PhD student with Frank, came up with the idea that, okay, in equilibrium, maybe this can't happen, but what happens if the system is driven out of equilibrium? You know, maybe I force the system some way, say periodically in time, like I'm pushing a child on a swing, but maybe the system could respond at a different frequency. So in other words, there's a discrete translational symmetry in time of my forcing, but the system adopts a different period, maybe twice the period, half the frequency, something like that. That would be what they call a Floquet time crystal. Floquet named after Gaston Floquet, who was a French mathematician in the 1870s or so, who first analyzed rigorously the structure of differential equations with periodic coefficients. Basically, you're forcing the system. And they basically said, imagine that the system is forced with symmetry under translation by t, and they say that the observable is invariant under translation by nt for some n greater than 1. In other words, the system responds at a fraction, omega over n, of the original driving frequency. And the classic example would be what is called a subharmonic response. So I force the system at a frequency omega, and somehow it responds at omega over 2. It takes twice as long to come back to where it was based on my forcing. So that's pretty neat. And in fact, there was this very interesting article written by Phil Receptors in Physics, which is a kind of parallel to some of the main physics journals. It's a commentary journal. And he basically talked about various recipes that experimental groups have come up to make such a time crystal. And he said, basically, any such time crystal should return back to its initial state at specific times while spontaneously locking to an oscillation period that differs from that of any external time-dependent forces. Hence, this definition excludes all known classical oscillatory systems such as waves or driven pendulums. Right, you have your child on the swing, you push the child periodically, and the child responds periodically until he or she falls off. But you know, they basically respond at the same frequency. Yeah? We all know. Not quite. Because so after that comment, then in Nature the following year, there was a pair of articles which basically said, we've seen time crystals. And they were exactly as predicted by these groups that studied these Floquet time crystals. Namely, you force the system at a certain period, and it responds at half the frequency. And they were two condensed matter systems consisting of spins of one sort or another that are responding to external magnetic fields. But when I saw Phil's article, I thought, this is a little weird, because actually, this is sort of well known. So I wrote to him. I'm getting all my secrets here. I wrote to him and I said, I'm reading your article, I was struck by the statement, which I just, that it excludes all classic oscillatory systems. I said, perhaps I'm misunderstanding what you said, but the statement of excluding all known classical systems is absolutely false. That is very brave. Sure, a driven pendulum will respond at the driving frequency, but a parametrically driven pendulum, one whose upper support is oscillated up and down, displays a whole ladder of responses given by the solutions of the associated mapping equations. So what am I talking about? If you have a pendulum like this, and you move the support up and down, you're essentially making gravity time dependent, which is different than forcing it from the outside. So if I make gravity time dependent, the equation I get has a cosine omega t inside the equation, essentially on the left-hand side, rather than a forcing on the right-hand side. And that is a well-studied problem. It's called a parametrically forced equation. And it's been studied since 1831 by Faraday, who first discovered a parametric instability. So I said, isn't this just that? And he wrote back and he said, thank you for your note. Let me clarify. These are fascinating systems, but what distinguishes a time crystal is that it breaks the symmetry of the underlying drive, and it does it in a way that is robust to small perturbations. In fact, there's a whole time crystal phase where the identical response is observed even as the drive parameters are varied. This is a very unique feature and requires very special things. Okay, and I wrote back and I said, well, no. Unless I'm mistaken, what you're describing is exactly what happens within the Arnold tongues of parametrically different systems. So I gave him a book, and I said the frequency locking is there is frequency locking as the parameters vary, and the systems do exactly what you say. They break time translation invariance with respect to the drive and are robust to noise. Ask any experimentalist. This is not just an isolated point, so I'm still puzzled. And then he wrote and said, thanks for bringing to my attention Arnold Thomas. I was not aware of him. Probably not many of you are aware of it, but this is textbook stuff. This is what you teach undergraduates in mathematics and physics in a classical dynamics course in their second or third year. He didn't know it, and I thought, that's ridiculous. So, that's why I say no one in this room, but this is really weird. So let me just show you what Faraday did. So Faraday wrote this famous paper in 1831. Now, many of you might be familiar with what are known as, I think it's pronounced Chladni or Chladni figures. You take a metal plate, you put some sand on it, then you take your nearest violin bow, and you strum the side of it. And that sets the plate in motion. And the sand grains will move around and accumulate in the nodes, the places where there is no amplitude of the vibration. You get these fantastic, complicated patterns depending upon the frequencies that you strum them. And this was of great interest in 1831. And Faraday wrote this fantastic paper where he talked about all the different aspects of that problem. But then in his appendix, he said, now what happens if you take this vibrating surface and instead of sand, you have a fluid layer. You have a thin layer of a fluid, it could be water or honey, you name it, and now you just oscillate it up and down. And what he discovered is now called the Faraday instability, which is that surface will undergo a beautiful instability, which I can show you a little video of. This is taken from what's called the Galileo Fluid Motion, which is a yearly sort of contest for beautiful pictures in fluid mechanics. And so basically you have a layer of fluid, think of a petri dish with water in it and or oil, and you're looking down from above. And you see interesting patterns. If you look from the side, you have a container. In this case, there are two fluids and an interface between them. And as you oscillate the container up and down, the interface goes unstable. And so here's a grid to show you what's going on. And at small amplitude, not much happens. But eventually, you'll start to see that a sort of sinusoidal excitation develops here. And if you look very carefully, you'll discover that this is what is called a subharmonic response. That is, that for every 2 cycles of the drive, you get 1 complete cycle of the liquid interface. And that's what Faraday discovered in 1831. And it's an amazing paper because he didn't have high-speed cameras, he didn't have strobe lights. He had just his cleverness to figure out how to see this. And he eventually did, and he talked about it like the 2 interleaved lattices of a checkerboard going up and down at half the frequency. And then it wasn't until 1954 that Benjamin and Ursel, of course everyone's from Cambridge as you see, actually did the mathematical theory of this. And in the end, you have to solve the wave equation for the small amplitude deformation of this droplet surface, and it turns out that each of the amplitudes of those modes, which are Bessel functions, obeys this differential equation. So d squared amplitude d time squared, time scaled appropriately, looks like some number times the amplitude. That would be a normal harmonic oscillator. And then a piece that looks like cosine of twice the time, and that's the parametric forcing. And in the space of P and Q, which correspond essentially to frequency squared and amplitude, you get these areas called resonance tongues, in which you get complete locking to the exact frequency, half the frequency, 3/2 the frequency over big parameter ranges. So this is perfectly well known and well established. And somehow the people running these papers didn't know that. And in fact, for those of you who have a ponytail, or have ever watched a ponytail on the head of a jogger, you will observe something quite interesting. As the jogger goes down the street and her head goes up and down, the ponytail goes side to side, which is already kind of funny. Why doesn't it just go up and down? But not only that, it goes side to side at half the frequency that the head is going up and down. And this is an analysis that the late mathematician Joe Keller wrote a beautiful paper about some years ago. And in fact, here's a controlled version of that experiment in my lab, in which, you laugh, but this is very sophisticated. We have a human ponytail on a bob, driven by a computer-controlled motor with illumination pretty high. And as you watch the bob go up and down, I waited too long, but the bob goes down and up, and this is halfway through, and then it goes down and up, and it's all the way through. So it's actually exactly subharmonic. And if you make a montage of this, you can see the bob goes down and back up. The ponytail is halfway through, down and back up, all the way through. So there's no doubt of what a subharmonic resonance is. Now, that's not to say that time crystals don't have interesting, different kinds of physics than this system. But the claim that no classical system displays this kind of behavior is just nonsense. Okay. Now I want to talk about discovering inspirational cleverness. So, in the late 1800s, Theodor Engelmann made a couple of astonishingly important discoveries in biology and plant science in particular. One of the things he did in 1881 was that he discovered bacteria that were chemotactic toward oxygen. That is, that they would swim toward high concentrations of oxygen. It's sometimes called oxygen taxis. So this was kind of interesting. There was a lot of interest in photosynthesis. There was a lot of interest in bacterial behavior. And he actually did a controlled experiment in which he could say, this species will swim up the gradient of oxygen. And then he wrote this fantastic paper a few years later in which he used these bacteria to measure the wavelength-dependent photosynthetic activity of a plant leaf. And that's called the action spectrum of photosynthesis. So the question that was all the rage those days was, what is the wavelength dependence of photosynthesis? We know that the spectrum of solar radiation is broad. Are plants responding in the red or the green? Where? And so he had this super clever idea, and the help of Carl Zeiss the man, not just the company, but Carl Zeiss the man, to build this specialized attachment to his microscope. So this attachment is a contraption with a mirror that looks at the sun and reflects the sun down into a prism. And that prism displays the solar spectrum spread out red to blue on the stage of the microscope. And on the stage of the microscope, he put a long, thin green alga, about 1 millimeter across and a few centimeters long, such that part of it was in the red and part of it was in the green and part of it was in the blue. And then he put in his oxygen-tactic bacteria, and lo and behold, they gathered around the alga in those regions where the photosynthesis was greatest and was producing oxygen, and he could read out the concentration of bacteria and deduce the rate of production of oxygen. And not only that, but you may know about these things called Fraunhofer lines, which are these lines in the solar spectrum that are basically missing, that is to say dark, because in the solar atmosphere there are atoms and molecules that have absorbed in that frequency. And those were known wavelengths. And so those Fraunhofer lines with their famous ABCD names were sitting there in the spectrum, so he could calibrate it and say, I know this wavelength, I know that wavelength. That's incredibly clever. He used bacteria as sensors in 1883. So, people who do synthetic biology now are doing exactly that, right? They're engineering bacteria to, say, light up with green fluorescent protein when they sense something. But Engelmann did it just with his cleverness and a very simple device. So, my last example of inspirational cleverness is also something done in Cambridge, here by Ken Machen, University of Cambridge Zoology Department in the late 50s. But it actually had its genesis in a rather impenetrable paper by Ludwig from 1930, which I didn't know about until Howard Berg admonished me and said, you need to know about Ludwig's paper. So the question of the day was this. If I look at a sperm cell, or any eukaryotic flagellated cell with one flagellum, you could see under the microscope in the 40s and 50s very easily that the undulations of the tail of the sperm were pretty much unchanging in amplitude from the head to the tail. So there might be two complete wavelengths of undulation with essentially constant amplitude to the tail. And the question of the day was, is this arising from some actuation mechanism at the junction between the tail and the head, some sort of, let's say, pivoting mechanism? Or are there force-generating devices all along the length of the sperm tail? At that time, nobody knew. Now, you might think the only way to answer this is to do sophisticated biology in which you basically dissect what's going on microscopically. But Machen came up with a super simple calculation to prove it must be one and not the other. Now I realize this is a diverse audience, but hopefully you get a flavor of what's going on. So he said, look, let's imagine an elastic filament. So that means that its energy is not associated with stretching it, but with bending it. And so the energy cost goes like the square of the curvature. So if I bend it this way, I won't break this. Bend it this way or that, it doesn't matter. Square of the curvature would have the zero at zero curvature in this straight form. And it's in a viscous fluid, so all the motions are without inertia. It's completely overdamped. And in that limit, there's a kind of Aristotelian dynamics in which force and velocity are proportional. So basically, it's some drag coefficient times the velocity gives me the resistive force on it, and I balance that with some elastic force. And since the velocity is the derivative of the height with respect to time, where I think of this thing as deformed in some shape h of x and t, then some drag coefficient times the velocity in the vertical direction goes like the restoring force, which is something called the bending modulus times the fourth derivative of the shape. Now, if you think about diffusion, which is the second derivative, this looks a bit unfamiliar, but that's the nature of elasticity. So it's just two more derivatives. Okay. And the point is that we know what this drag coefficient is for a long slender object, and so you can just try to solve this equation. It's a linear equation. You solve it with some boundary conditions. So the simplest thing you could do is imagine a semi-infinite flagellum, and I just wiggle one end. So I just let h be h naught cosine omega t. So it's like flipping a rope and just asking what's the shape. And so you can solve it. This is a Trapos exercise. And so h is h naught times a damped cosine traveling wave to the left and another damped cosine traveling wave to the right, where these numbers c and c are just given here. And I've scaled lengths by a characteristic length, which is related to the modulus and the frequency. Now, don't worry about the details. The point of this is that if you just make a graph of these things, these exponential decays on top of these cosines are very rapid. And it doesn't matter what you do, how you force it at the end, whether you pivot it, whether you do it like this, you will get about one wavelength at most before the amplitude is negligible. You can't get beyond that. The equation will not allow it. So he said, well, I do all these calculations, I see that everything dies off in one wavelength. That's not the case in the experiment. Hence, I conclude there must be force-generating devices everywhere along the filament, and he was right. We now know that the mechanism of actuation of flagella is molecular motors, which are proteins that change their conformation in response to consuming ATP and slide the filaments that make up the flagella relative to each other. If you clamp the base and slide, there must be bending, and those bending waves are happening all along the length by consumption all along the length. And he just did that in a 3-line calculation. 4 lines. Maybe 5. But still, it's quite a leap of creative imagination. Okay, so I want to finish by talking about, of course, Turing's great paper on the chemical basis of morphogenesis. How many of you have heard of it, at least? How many of you read anything beyond the title? Okay. I strongly recommend you read it. It is one of the landmark papers in science in the last century. It's up there with Einstein's book. It's because it basically overturned completely overturned a paradigm of thinking about a fundamental phenomenon in the natural sciences, which is diffusion. Because we always think about diffusion as something that homogenizes concentration fields, that spreads things out. And what he showed was that the combination of diffusion, which tends to spread things out, and nonlinear chemical kinetics of almost any sort can produce patterns. Now, the thing about his paper, I won't read this whole thing, the thing about his paper is that it also introduced to us a notation, a terminology about the chemicals that participate in patterning called morphogens, which are now universally used. But the one thing that you'll find, if you talk to biologists who are at all attuned to biological pattern information, they'll say, yeah, it's an important paper, but it was wrong. I say, well, what do you mean it was wrong? They say, well, the particular mechanism that he outlined, which I'll tell you about in a second, isn't actually what happens in biology, so it's wrong. To which I say, no, you're wrong. The mechanism that you're talking about is just a special case of the general result that he found. Because when you tell me that genes turn on and off and stuff diffuses in their patterns, that's what he was saying. He was just giving a particular example, actually he gave 7 particular examples, of the mathematics of the way this would happen. But the physical phenomenology is there. And that's what I mean about avoiding sound bites. That if you've never read the paper, you get this kind of soundbite, like we get now by reading things on Twitter, that is a caricature of what's going on, and it's worth actually reading the paper. Now I bring this up because last year, I should say published, but at the time I wrote this slide, it was not. Some collaborators of mine and I were interested in a problem that is familiar to many of you, which is that your clothes don't fall apart. Right? So if you think about the threads that make up the fabrics that we're all wearing, whether it's cotton or wool, these are woven, these are twisted fibers, say cotton fibers, that are actually very short. So if you buy a spool of thread in the store, it may be 100 meters long. But if you ask yourself, how long are the individual pieces of cotton? Maybe 4 centimeters, 3 centimeters. And so there's a natural question, which is, how does it all hold together? All you do is twist it. And why doesn't it just fall apart if you pull on it? So it's actually a pretty non-trivial problem to understand, because, yeah, of course, friction plays a role, but exactly how does the mechanics work? Why doesn't it just slide this way? After all, friction can only hold so far. So we were interested in this because we had previously been interested in hair. And we wrote this paper explaining some of the mathematics and how it would work. And just before we sent it off, my collaborator, Patrick Warren, who works at Unilever Research, said to me, oh, wait a minute, I think we better be careful here, because actually this question was asked before by Galileo. So then the cover page of Galileo's famous Dialogue on Two New Sciences, which was published in 1628. Am I saying that right? Yeah. And 1538, whatever it was, 15. And notice it's published by Elsevier. Elsevier. So there was a time when they were a reputable publisher. And so I don't know. Have you ever read some of this book? Because it's quite amazing. No? Yes. It's fantastic because he understood so many things, and the way he set up the book was basically he had this fictitious discussant named Salviati, who would ask him questions. He'd say, "Oh, Salviati, let me tell you the answer." And so one of those was like this: Salviati, how are fibers, each not more than 2 or 3 cubits in length? Remember what a cubit is? So tightly bound together in the case of a rope 100 cubits long that great force is required to break it. So we weren't the first to ask this question. Now, of course, Galileo didn't answer it. But we thought, oh no, we can't make this claim that our paper is so great because it asked this question. But then we realized that there's nothing wrong with acknowledging the old literature. In fact, if you do it right, you can make it a much more interesting paper because you can rewrite your introduction to say, in his celebrated dialogue, Galileo identified a fascinating puzzle in the mechanics of roads. And then you've hooked your reader in because you're saying, look at this great history that we're now joining with. So that's an important lesson to take from this. There's no shame in talking about the old literature. In fact, it makes for much more interesting papers. It makes for much more interesting talks. It makes for much more interesting science to know what the motivations were. Now, the last thing I want to say is the motto of the Royal Society is nullius in verba, which means basically don't take anyone's word for it. And that's basically what I'm saying, that by going back to the old literature, you can see for yourself what actually happened. So when I wrote this paper about coffee stains and all of that, I wrote to my friend Tom Whitten, who's a professor, very distinguished professor at the University of Chicago. And I said, look, I'm writing this paper, I'm not going to come down hard on you, I just want you to see it beforehand so you understand what I'm saying and give me any comments. And he said, listen, I know of a Benjamin Franklin paper where he measured Avogadro's number by pouring oil on a pond. This is when he was an ambassador in England. I guess it must have been a few years before 1776. It would be good to include that one, as I imagined you did. Okay. And I looked at this and I thought, wait a minute. I'm not sure this makes sense. I knew Benjamin Franklin poured oil on a pond. How can he measure Avogadro's number? Because Benjamin Franklin lived from 1706 to 1790. And Avogadro lived from 1776 to 1856, and he proposed a law in 1811, long after Franklin was dead. And Avogadro's number was not actually measured until 1865, and it was given his name by Faraday in 1909. So I went back to the original paper, and sure enough, what Galileo, sorry, what Franklin did was he calmed the waves on the surface of a pond. And similar kinds of measurements were used to determine the size of a molecule by the following assumption. You say, if I know the volume of oil that I poured down, and I know the area that it occupies, then I just have a disk with some thickness, and I can determine that thickness, and I'll get a few nanometers, and I go, that's the size of the molecule. But I haven't counted that. So that's another important thing, but don't take anyone's word for it, no matter how distinguished they are. So I should say that I decided that I should put together a collection of classic papers that everybody should read. And so if you go to my website, you can click on this list, and they're not only the ones that I think are important, but friends of mine have contributed. If you like something that you think we all should read, let me know, and I'll put it there. And I want to thank many people who contributed to this endeavor, and thank you.
Thank you for the fantastic talk. We do have a couple of minutes for Q&A as well. So does anyone have any questions?
Or answers.
All right. Well, there you go.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering, like, where this kind of semi-encyclopedic knowledge of old papers would come from. Like, how much time would you dedicate to reading the old papers?
Well, I don't, as I kind of alluded to before, I just don't go to the library or sit online and say, today I'll read whatever. The fact is, I just somehow got trained by example. I think that when I'm into a new research project, I just keep digging. That it's a skill that you learn. The phrase I used in the paper was to ferret out the origin of ideas. And it's just become a habit. So I was interested in certain aspects of plant science, and you know, in plants, there's the in plant cells, there's the vacuole. So I said, who discovered the vacuole first? And so I look back, and it's great. His name was Dujardin of the garden. And you know, there are all these interesting things out there, and I do it because my experience is it makes for more interesting talks and more interesting papers, and sometimes I realize that the motivations were different. So it's a habit, and I try to instill it in my students, and that's why I wrote the paper. I was trying to tell everybody, wake up, stop just reading the latest postings on the arXiv and thinking that that's everything. And I have gotten in the habit of writing an obscene number of emails to people entitled "Your arXiv paper," where I see something on the arXiv and I realize, come on, don't you know that 20 years ago X did this? And so I'm constantly doing it. So I mean, I still have a day job, but but I think it's a problem. It's a real problem with the way science is being done now, and I think it's much more enjoyable to think about all these connections. Yeah. Just read.
Would you say that some connections can be built not only to old papers, but contemporary papers, but in totally different disciplines, where some parallels can be built, like with electrostatic and...
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, in fact, I think this just motivates you to think about current problems exactly in that way. And that's why I think, you know, the other problem, this university is less guilty of this than many others, because for instance, the college system mixes everybody up in a nice way. But it's just too easy for people to get stuck in their little corner, their little silo, and not even talk to people in other disciplines. And I think that's really the lesson, that you know, it's a social activity. And just, even if you don't know that there's something specific that will come out of it, just the idea that it's interesting to hear what other people do. I mean, I once talked to an astrophysicist at a major North American university, and he asked me what I did, and I said, biological fluid mechanics. And he looked at me and he said, is fluid mechanics important for biology? And I thought of answering him like this. You can't hear me unless there's, you know, fluid in between. And you know, there's your heart, and there are your lungs. And you know, I mean, everything in your body is fluid mechanics and biology. So I thought, what planet does he live on? Not to realize it. Yeah. So, talk to me.
What's the earliest published paper that you have read?
Well, the elder Pliny wrote some very interesting things. So about 15 years ago, I worked on, and I think we still solved, the question of why stalactites have the shape that they do. Why are they long and pointed? Can you quantify that? And we discovered, actually, that the earliest reference we could find was to the elder Pliny, who people have been going into caves for as long as they've been humans. And he made comments about the shapes and all of that. I think that's the earliest. Although, if you go back, so there's a problem we're working on now involving bioluminescence, which is the spontaneous emission of light by microorganisms, and goes back to Babylonian times. People are making comments about this. There's nothing scientific you learn about it, but you do realize that people have been worrying about this problem for a long time.
I think one barrier for a lot of us in reading really old papers is how different the language was and how much science communication has evolved. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that. Are there things we can learn about how people used to communicate science in the past? Like, what are your thoughts on comparing the way we write papers now and how we used to title them and write them in the past?
Well, the titles are often much better, but they're much more descriptive and long-winded and all of that. I find it interesting that so many of the older papers were, well, especially when the Royal Society came out, for instance, it was one of the first scientific organizations to sort of cultivate this discussion among people and the idea of experimental confirmation and all that. And people were just reporting what they did last week. And we've gone away from this kind of blue skies, let's just look and see what happens kind of experimenting. I mean, I'm a theorist as well as an experimentalist, but some of what I do is basically, we have no idea about this, let's just try. And of course, in those days, you just wrote a paper and said, what I found under the microscope in June, July, and August. So I think it also tells us that we need the inner child in us to stay and not go. And that, I think, is an important lesson. That when it becomes so mission-oriented, that what we have to do instead of this kind of wonder, then we've lost something, I think. Of course, telling that to the research councils, not so easy.
What's your favourite paper of these old ones?
I think it's Engelmann, actually. It's so incredibly clever. Because it combines a really clever apparatus with a really clever idea, and the organisms read out for you. It's amazing. It's in German, so it helps to have a German postdoc to read it and explain, because it's impossible.
In general, do you think scientists used to be clever?
No, there are plenty of clever people at all times, I think, but they had to make do with much simpler devices. They didn't have iPhones, all these things. And so I think their powers of visual observation were more highly developed. When you look at a lot of the old literature, you'll find hand drawings of things, with detail that is just extraordinary. And you take a picture now of the same thing and you go, I don't quite see that, because they spent days staring under the microscope, fiddling with the lighting, really understanding what was going on. And so I think in some ways their powers of observation were more highly developed, and we just think, just take a picture. So I think that's an important lesson. That you just have to, there's a famous American baseball player and manager named Yogi Berra. So he was famous for saying things which sound like he's a little bit slow upstairs, but were actually very profound, possibly. Like if you see a fork in the road, take it. However, there was one thing he said which is my motto, which is, you can see a lot by looking. So you just choose to look and forget everything else. You can actually see.
Awesome lessons, thank you. We will hang about for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes afterwards if you want to ask any questions in person. And could we have one last round of applause to things?